In Billings, Montana, the hottest temperature ever recorded is 108 degrees. In Salt Lake City, it is 107. This weekend, both of those all-time records are in danger of falling at the same time, because a dome of high pressure has stalled over the western United States and is baking the same ground day after day with no relief. And here is what most of the coverage will miss. That dome is not just breaking heat records. It is the same feature drawing a drought-stricken landscape and feeding 10 wildfires already burning across the interior west, all at once, one system wearing 3 faces, and the forecast is telling us this has barely started. So how hot does it actually get? Which cities are closest to the edge? And why is this so far from over? Subscribe to the Sky Lab and stay with this, because this pattern is not moving on, and we're going to follow it everywhere it goes. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and whether it is the heat, the wildfire smoke, or the flooding that is hitting you where you live. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The dome that won't move. Somewhere over the deserts of the American West this weekend, the sky has stopped behaving like weather and started behaving like a lid. There is a mass of high pressure sitting over the western and north-central United States right now, and it is not drifting east the way these things usually do. It is parked. It is anchored. And underneath it, in cities that have kept careful temperature records for more than a century, thermometers are climbing toward numbers that have never been reached before in the entire history of those places. Not the hottest for a July 12th. The hottest. Period. The hottest they have ever been on any day of any year since people started writing the numbers down. That is what is on the table this weekend, and I want to walk you through exactly how it happened. Because the story of these records is really the story of one enormous stubborn feature in the sky that simply refuses to move. Let me show you what we are actually dealing with. Up above your head, higher than the clouds, higher than where the passenger jets fly, there is a level of the atmosphere that meteorologists watch more closely than almost anything else. We measure it by pressure rather than by height, and the number we care about this weekend is a ridge of high pressure with heights above 594 decameters. If that number means nothing to you, that's completely fine, because here is the only thing you need to understand about it. That value is high. It is anomalously high. It is the atmospheric equivalent of a wave that has swelled far above the normal waterline and then, instead of crashing and rolling forward, has frozen in place. A ridge that strong, sitting where this one is sitting, is a dome. And a dome does something very specific to the air trapped beneath it. Air under a ridge of high pressure sinks. As it sinks, it gets compressed by the weight of everything above it, and compressed air heats up. This is not sunlight warming the ground, and the ground warming the air, although that happens too. This is the atmosphere heating itself simply by being crushed downward from above. The sinking motion also flattens out clouds and burns them off, which strips away the one thing that might have offered a little shade, so the sunlight comes pouring straight down onto a surface that has nothing to protect it. You get relentless sun, sinking hot air and no clouds, all at once, in the same place, day after day. That is the machinery of a heat dome, and it is the engine behind every single record we're going to talk about today. But the strength of the ridge is only half of the story, and honestly it is the less important half. The part that turns an ordinary hot spell into a genuinely dangerous record-breaking event is that this dome is not moving. Under normal circumstances, weather in the middle latitudes of the planet marches from west to east. Systems come, systems go. A hot day is followed by a cooler one because the ridge that brought the heat slides off to the east and lets something else move in behind it. That constant progression is what makes weather feel like weather. It changes. This weekend that progression has stalled. The steering currents that would normally shove this dome along have gone slack, and the ridge is just sitting there, reheating the same ground over and over, like a burner left on under an empty pan. And this is the thread I need you to hold on to through this entire video, because everything else hangs from it. One stuck dome is doing all of this. It is not 3 separate disasters that happen to be occurring at the same time. It is one feature in the sky, one lid over the country, producing what looks like 3 different catastrophes at once. It is going to push those cities toward their all-time records. It is going to deepen a drought that already has its hands around the throat of a third of this country. And it is going to take a landscape that is already on fire and pour gasoline on it. Heat, drought, and fire. 3 faces One dome. Keep that in your mind as we go, because the moment you see them as one connected system instead of 3 headlines, the whole weekend suddenly makes a terrible kind of sense. So why has the dome stopped moving? To answer that, you have to look even higher and think about the river of fast-moving air that circles the planet up where the jets fly. We call it the jet stream, and it is the great conveyor belt that pushes our weather along from west to east. When the jet stream is flowing fast and relatively straight, weather moves quickly and nothing gets a chance to sit still. But the jet stream does not always flow straight. Sometimes it buckles. It develops enormous looping waves, great ridges that bulge northward and deep troughs that plunge southward, and when those waves get big enough they can slow to a crawl. Picture a fast, narrow stream of water. It runs straight and quick. Now picture that same stream widening into big, lazy meanders across a flat plain. The water slows down, it pools, it stops rushing. That is what has happened to the atmosphere over North America this weekend. The jet has buckled into a big northward bulge over the west, and that bulge has stalled, and the dome is riding inside it, going nowhere. There is a genuine scientific debate about why this kind of stalling seems to be happening, and I want to be honest with you about it rather than pretend the science is more settled than it is. There is a hypothesis, associated with researchers like Jennifer Francis and Stephen Vavris, that as the Arctic warms faster than the rest of the planet, the temperature difference between the far north and the middle latitudes shrinks, and that shrinking difference may be making the jet stream wavier and more prone to getting stuck. It is a compelling idea, and there is real evidence being marshalled on both sides of it, but it is not a closed case. Some studies support it, others push back, and the honest answer is that atmospheric scientists are still arguing about it. What is not in dispute is what is happening on the ground beneath the stall this weekend, and that is where the numbers stop being abstract and start being frightening. Because here is what a stalled dome does to a calendar. On a normal hot day, the heat builds through the afternoon and then breaks. The sun goes down, the air cools, the ground releases its heat back to the sky, and by morning the system has partially reset. You wake up, and it is bearable again. But when the dome refuses to move, that reset never fully happens. Each day starts a little warmer than the last one because last night never cooled all the way down. The heat accumulates, it stacks. Day 2 is worse than day 1, day 3 is worse than day 2, and the peak of the whole thing lands on Sunday, when the numbers are forecast to reach 100 to 110 degrees across parts of Montana and North Dakota, running 15 to 25 degrees above where they should be for the middle of July. That is not a warm summer weekend. That is a 15 to 25 degree departure from normal, held in place by a dome that will not budge, and the reach of this thing is enormous. We are not talking about one unlucky city. The Weather Prediction Center, the arm of the National Weather Service that looks at the big national picture, has flagged what they call major to extreme heat risk, and they are saying it is going to persist into late next week. Persist. That word matters. This is not a spike that comes and goes in an afternoon. This is a condition that settles in and stays, and the reason it stays is the same reason we started with. The dome will not move. Everything that follows in this video, every record, every acre of fire, every dried out riverbed, traces back to that single fact. Let me give you a better feel for just how anomalous this ridge really is, because the number 594 decameters is meaningless until you have something to compare it against. Think of the atmosphere over a given region as having a normal range, a set of values it wanders between across a typical summer, high on the hot days and lower on the cool ones. A ridge in the 590-plus range is not at the top of that normal band. It is well above it, out past where the atmosphere usually goes, into territory that a given location might only see a handful of times in a decade, if that. When forecasters describe a ridge like this as anomalous, they are not reaching for a dramatic word. They are describing, in the most literal sense, an atmosphere that has swelled beyond its own normal ceiling, and the whole reason the records are in play is that a ridge beyond the normal ceiling produces surface temperatures beyond the normal ceiling. The height anomaly aloft becomes a temperature anomaly at the ground. That is the chain, top to bottom, and it is why one number up high can foretell all-time records down below. There is another feature of this dome that makes it especially punishing, and it has to do with where in the country it has chosen to sit. The core of the heat, that 100 to 110 degree window, running 15 to 25 degrees above normal, is centered over the northern plains, over Montana and North Dakota, and that is not a region that is built, physically or culturally, for that kind of heat. These are places where the infrastructure, the housing stock, the daily rhythms of life are calibrated for a climate that is supposed to be milder than the desert southwest. Air conditioning is less universal, bodies are less acclimatized. 110 degrees in a place accustomed to seeing it is dangerous. 110 degrees in a place that rarely does is something else, because far fewer of the usual defences are in place. The dome has parked its worst over some of the country, least prepared to absorb it, and that geographic mismatch is part of why the record threat this weekend carries such a sharp human edge. And I want to underline the stalling one more time, from a slightly different angle, because it is the single most important property of this system, and it is the one people most often overlook. We are conditioned to think of extreme weather as violent and fast, a tornado, a flash flood, a hurricane's landfall, events measured in minutes and hours. A heat dome is the opposite kind of extreme. Its danger comes not from speed but from duration. It is a slow disaster, and its weapon is time. The longer it sits, the deeper it bakes, the more the nights fail to cool, the more the drought tightens and the fuels cure. A dome that lasted a single afternoon would barely register. This one is forecast to hold its grip for days and to be followed by more of the same, and that persistence is precisely what converts an uncomfortable hot spell into a record-threatening, life-endangering event. Speed is not the threat here. Refusal to leave is the threat, and that refusal is the thread that ties every face of this thing together, because a dome that will not move is a dome that gets to do all of its damage on all three fronts without interruption. So let me leave you at the edge of the first big question, because it is the one that turns this from a forecast into a story. We know the dome is strong, we know it is stuck, we know the heat is going to peak on Sunday. But when a city that has been keeping records since the 1800s threatens the hottest temperature in its entire history, you have to ask what it actually takes to get there, and which cities are closest to the edge, and what it means when a place breaks not a daily record but an all-time one. Because there is a difference between those two things that most people have never had explained to them, and once you understand it, you will never look at a heat headline the same way again. Part 2. The Cities on the Edge. There are two kinds of temperature records, and almost nobody outside of meteorology understands the difference between them, which is a shame, because the difference is exactly what makes this weekend so unusual. Let me fix that for you right now, because once you get it, you will understand why the forecasters watching this event are using words they normally save for genuine emergencies. The first kind of record is a daily record. That is the hottest it has ever been on one specific date. So if a city hits a daily record for July 12th, it means that particular calendar square, July 12th, has never been hotter in the history of that station. It is a real thing, and it happens somewhere in the country almost every single day of the summer, because there are 365 calendar squares and a lot of cities, and you are always going to be setting the record for some date somewhere. Daily records are common enough that a weather-aware person learns to shrug at them. They are the background noise of a warm season. The second kind of record is an all-time record, and this is a completely different animal. An all-time record is not the hottest it has ever been on a given date. It is the hottest it has ever been on any date. Ever. The single, highest temperature that station has recorded across its entire history, whether that history runs back 80 years or 150. When a city threatens its all-time record, it is threatening to be hotter than it has been on the worst afternoon of the worst heatwave anyone alive there has ever lived through. That does not happen every day. That does not happen most summers. In a lot of cities, the all-time record has stood, untouched, for decades. And this weekend, under this stuck dome, two major cities are staring down exactly that possibility. The first is Salt Lake City, Utah. The all-time record high there is 107 degrees. Sit with that number for a second, because it is not just a big number, it is a ceiling. It represents the hottest that a city of well over 1 million people in its metro area has ever gotten, across every summer that has ever been recorded there. And this weekend, the forecast has it flirting with that exact figure. The dome we talked about in the first part of this video, the one that will not move, is going to sink hot, compressed, cloudless air right down onto the Salt Lake Valley, and the models are saying it could push the thermometer to the very edge of a number that has stood as the maximum for that city's entire existence. The second city is Billings, Montana, where the all-time record high is 108 degrees. Billings sits in a part of the country that is going to take the very core of this dome. Remember, the peak of the heat, that 100 to 110 degree window running 15 to 25 degrees above normal, is forecast for central and eastern Montana into North Dakota, and Billings is right in the crosshairs. When you put a city directly under the hottest part of a stalled dome and hold it there for days so that each night fails to cool it down, you create exactly the conditions under which an all-time record falls. And that is the danger this weekend, not a daily record that will be forgotten by Monday. An all-time record, the kind that redefines what the hottest day in a city's history even means. Now I want to reconnect this to the thread, because it is easy to get lost in individual city numbers and forget what is actually producing them. These records are not happening by accident, and they are not happening in isolation. They are the direct, measurable fingerprint of that one-stuck dome. Salt Lake City and Billings are not having bad luck. They are sitting underneath the same lid, and the lid is doing to them precisely what the physics says it should. The all-time records are simply the loudest, most legible signal the atmosphere can send us to say, this dome is extreme, and it is not letting go. Let me widen the lens beyond just those two cities, because the record threat is really a regional one. Across the northern plains, forecast highs are climbing into that 100 to 110 degree range, locally even higher. The hottest raw air temperatures are expected to bake into southwestern North Dakota. But raw air temperature is not the whole story of how dangerous heat actually is, because the human body does not only care about the temperature on the thermometer, it also cares about the humidity, and this is where the northwestern part of North Dakota comes into the picture, because that is where the nastiest humidity is forecast to set up. When you combine high temperature with high humidity, you get what we call the heat index, the feels-like temperature, and the heat index can run well above the raw number. So even in places where the thermometer does not quite reach the all-time record, the combination of heat and moisture can push the danger to the human body past what the raw temperature alone would suggest. Why does humidity matter so much? Because your body's entire cooling system runs on evaporation. When you get hot, you sweat, and when that sweat evaporates off your skin, it carries heat away with it. That is the whole trick. That is how a human being sheds excess warmth. But evaporation only works if the surrounding air has room to accept the moisture. When the air is already thick with humidity, your sweat cannot evaporate efficiently, so it just sits on your skin, dripping, doing nothing, while your core temperature keeps climbing. That is why a humid 95 degrees can be more dangerous than a bone-dry 105. The dry heat lets you sweat and cool, the humid heat traps you. And this weekend, parts of the northern plains are going to get both the extreme temperature and, in spots, the trapping humidity, which is the worst possible combination for the human body. This is also why the official language coming out of the National Weather Service is so pointed. There is an extreme heat warning in effect across huge portions of Wyoming, covering central, north-central, northwest, south-central, southwest, and west-central parts of the state. The warning calls for dangerously hot conditions of 100 to 110 degrees below 6,000 feet and 90 to 100 degrees between 6,000 and 7,500 feet, with the hottest temperatures landing on Sunday afternoon and the whole thing running through 9 at night on Monday. An extreme heat warning is not a casual product. The Weather Service does not issue that language for an ordinary summer day. It is the top tier, the one they reserve for heat that can put people in the hospital or worse. And there is an extreme heat watch already up for central and western North Dakota, kicking in Saturday afternoon, which is the forecasters telling you the same thing is coming for the Dakotas right behind Wyoming. It is worth pausing on what it actually takes for a place like Salt Lake City or Billings to reach an all-time record, because these are not places that flirt with their maximums casually. A city's all-time high usually sits several degrees above its typical hot summer peak, which means that in an ordinary year, even a genuinely hot one, the record is never seriously threatened. You have to have everything line up. You need the strong ridge to provide the raw heat. You need the stall to let the heat compound day over day. You need dry ground beneath, so that none of the sun's energy gets siphoned off into evaporation, and all of it goes into raising the temperature. and you need it to happen at the peak of summer when the sun is highest and the days are longest. This weekend, every one of those conditions is being met at the same time in the same place, which is exactly why the records that normally sit comfortably out of reach are suddenly in play. It is the alignment that is rare, not any single ingredient, and the alignment is what the dome has assembled. And notice how that list of ingredients maps almost perfectly onto our central thread. The strong ridge and the stall are the dome refusing to move. The dry ground is the drought, the second face. So the very conditions required to break an all-time heat record are the same conditions that define the triple threat as a whole. You cannot get the record without the drought supplying the dry ground, and you cannot get either without the dome supplying the stalled heat. The record is not a separate phenomenon from the drought and the fire. It is the same set of ingredients, read on the thermometer instead of on the drought map or the fire line. When you understand that, the phrase all-time record stops being a piece of trivia and becomes a diagnostic, a single number that tells you the entire three-phase system is running near its peak. You can actually watch the danger build in the raw count of alerts. In a single day, the number of active National Weather Service alerts across the country jumped from 238 to 319. That is an increase of 81 alerts in 24 hours. Now, I want to be honest and precise with you, because a big chunk of that total, around 130 of them, are overseas marine and territory advisories that have nothing to do with the heat over the continental United States, so the effective domestic count is lower than 319. But the day-over-day surge is real, and it is being driven by exactly the hazards we are talking about, heat and fire weather, and flooding all stacking up on top of one another. The alert map is lighting up because the dome is doing its work. Let me sit with the idea of an all-time record for another moment, because I think the true weight of it only lands when you translate it out of statistics and into human lives. A city's all-time record high is not just a data point. It is a boundary that defines the entire lived experience of everyone who has ever called that place home. Think about the oldest resident of Billings, someone who has lived there for 90 years. Across their entire life, through every summer they can remember, the hottest day they ever endured did not exceed 108 degrees, because that is the record, and a record is by definition the most extreme thing that has ever happened. So when the forecast says a city is threatening its all-time high, what it is really saying is that this weekend could be hotter than the hottest day in the memory of the oldest person there. It could rewrite the ceiling of human experience for that place. That is a different order of event than a daily record, and it is why the forecasters watching it are choosing their words so carefully. And these records do not fall in isolation from one another, which is part of what makes this weekend so striking. When a single dome parks over a broad region, it does not threaten one city's record while sparing the rest. It presses on all of them at once, so you are not looking at one isolated station having a freak day. You are looking at the possibility of multiple cities, across multiple states, all challenging their all-time marks in the same window, because they are all sitting under the same lid. That clustering is itself a signature of how extreme the underlying pattern is. Daily records scatter randomly across the map all summer long. All-time records challenged in a cluster, in the same weekend, in the same region, under the same dome, is the atmosphere telling you that this is not the ordinary churn of summer. This is a genuine outlier event, and the geographic spread of the record threat is the proof. I also want to make sure you understand why the timing within the weekend matters so much, because it circles right back to our central thread. The reason Sunday is the peak is not arbitrary. It is the accumulation point. The dome moved in, and each day under it has built on the last, because the stalling means nothing resets overnight. Saturday is hotter than Friday, and Sunday is hotter than Saturday, and that is precisely because the dome will not move. If this ridge was sliding through the way a normal system does, no single day would get the chance to stack on top of the one before it, and the records would be far less threatened. It is the stuck quality, the refusal to leave, that lets the heat compound to the point where all-time marks come into range on the third day. So even the calendar of this event, the fact that Sunday is the dangerous day, is a direct fingerprint of the one thing we keep returning to. The dome is not moving, and because it is not moving, the heat gets to build to its record-threatening peak. So we have established the record threat, and we have established why the humidity makes it worse in places, and we have established that the Weather Service is treating this with its most serious language. But here is the thing that keeps me up at night about a setup like this one, and it is not the afternoon high at all. The number that actually decides whether a heatwave becomes a body count is not the peak temperature you see at 3 in the afternoon. It is a completely different number, one that shows up in the dead of night when everyone assumes the danger has passed. And this weekend, that overnight number is doing something that turns a dangerous heatwave into a potentially deadly one. Let me show you what happens after dark, because that is where this story gets genuinely grim. Part 3. The danger, hiding in the dark. Here is the number that matters more than any afternoon high you will see plastered across a weather graphic this weekend. The overnight lows in the hardest hit areas under this dome are forecast to barely drop below 75 degrees. That is it. That is the whole terrifying detail hiding in plain sight, buried under all the flashier 110 headlines. And if you do not understand why a warm night is so much more dangerous than a hot afternoon, then you do not yet understand how heat actually kills people. So let me explain it, because this is the part of the story that the human body cannot argue with. Your body is, in a very real sense, a furnace that never shuts off. Every cell in you is burning fuel and producing heat, all day and all night, and to stay alive you have to shed that heat at roughly the same rate you make it. During a heat wave, the daytime is a losing battle. The air is hotter than you are, the sun is relentless, and your cooling system, that evaporation of sweat we talked about, is working overtime just to keep you from overheating. You're running a deficit all afternoon. Your core temperature creeps up. You accumulate heat you cannot get rid of fast enough. That is the stress of a hot day, and a healthy body can take a certain amount of it. But then the sun goes down, and on a normal night, relief arrives. The air cools. The ground radiates its stored heat up into a clear sky. The temperature falls into the 60s, maybe the 50s, and your body finally gets to catch up. All that accumulated heat from the afternoon gets shed overnight. Your core temperature comes back down to baseline. Your heart, which has been working hard all day pumping blood to your skin to cool you, finally gets to rest. By morning, you have reset. You are ready to face the next day. That nightly reset is not a luxury. It is the mechanism that lets human beings survive hot weather at all. Now take that reset away. When the overnight low only falls to 75 degrees, the reset never fully happens. The air never gets cool enough for your body to dump the heat it accumulated during the day. So you go into the next morning already carrying a load you could not shed. And then the sun comes up and the dome bakes you again, and you add more heat on top of the heat you never got rid of. And the next night it only falls to 75 again. So you shed even less, and the morning after that you're carrying 2 days of accumulated heat, and then 3. The stress does not reset each day. It compounds, it stacks, night over night, exactly the way the heat itself stacks under a dome that will not move. And this is the direct physical link back to our central thread, because it is the same stuck dome doing this. A dome that will not move is a dome that will not let the nights cool, and nights that will not cool are what turn heat from uncomfortable into lethal. And there is a term for the point at which this stops being merely uncomfortable and starts being physiologically impossible to withstand, which is worth understanding even though we are not there this weekend. Your body cools by evaporating sweat, and that process has a hard limit set by the combination of heat and humidity together. Push past that limit, and no amount of sweating can shed heat fast enough, and your core temperature begins an unstoppable climb, regardless of how healthy you are or how much water you drink. We are not at that absolute ceiling in the northern plains this weekend, because the very worst of that scenario requires humidity levels beyond what this dome is producing over most of the region. But the principle is the same one operating in miniature every warm night that fails to cool. Every degree the night holds above where it should be is a degree closer to the edge of what the body can compensate for, and for a frail or elderly person, that edge is much closer than it is for a healthy adult. The warm nights this weekend are not at the theoretical limit, but for the most vulnerable, they do not need to be. Their edge arrives first. This is also why the danger of a heat wave is so easy to underestimate from the outside, and why it kills quietly compared to more dramatic weather. A tornado leaves a visible scar. A flood leaves a waterline. Heat leaves almost nothing you can photograph. Its victims are found indoors, often days into an event, often alone, and the cause of death is frequently recorded as a heart attack or an organ failure rather than heat itself. which means the true toll is routinely undercounted and underappreciated. Heat is, by most measures, the deadliest form of weather in the country, deadlier than tornadoes and hurricanes and floods, and yet it commands the least visceral fear, precisely because it does its work invisibly, in bedrooms and living rooms, over hours and days, rather than in a single violent moment. That invisibility is part of what makes the warm night danger this weekend so worth naming out loud, because the thing that will hurt the most people is the thing that will make the least noise. We know this is how it works because we have watched it happen, in real cities, with real death tolls, and the history is unambiguous. Go back to the Chicago heat wave of 1995. Over the course of about 5 days in July, more than 700 people died in that city. 700 people. And when researchers went back and studied exactly why that particular heat wave was so deadly, one of the biggest factors they identified was the nighttime temperatures. The nights did not cool down. The city, full of brick and concrete and asphalt that had soaked up heat all day, stayed hot after dark, and people, especially elderly people living alone in apartments without air conditioning, never got the overnight relief their bodies needed. They went to sleep hot and they did not wake up. The afternoon highs got the headlines, but it was the warm nights that filled the morgues. Fast forward to the summer of 2021 and the Pacific Northwest heat dome, which is really the closest modern cousin to what we are watching this weekend. That was a stalled ridge, just like this one, parked over a region that was not built for that kind of heat. Temperatures shattered all-time records across Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. And again, part of what made it so deadly was that the nights offered no escape. An estimated 600 or more people died across the region. The village of Lytton, in British Columbia, reached 49.6 degrees Celsius, which is 121.3 degrees Fahrenheit, the hottest temperature ever recorded in Canada, and the very next day the town burned to the ground. Hold on to that last detail because it is going to matter later in this video when we get to the fire side of this dome. The same event that broke the all-time heat record also produced the fire that destroyed the town. Heat and fire, two faces of one dome in one place on back-to-back days. So when I tell you that the overnight lows this weekend are forecast to hold near 75 degrees across the hardest hit areas, I am not giving you a footnote. I am giving you the single most important number in the entire forecast, because it is the number that historically separates a heatwave people complain about from a heatwave people die in, and the populations most at risk are exactly the ones who cannot easily protect themselves. The elderly, whose bodies regulate temperature less efficiently and who often live alone. The very young, whose small bodies heat up fast. People with heart conditions or kidney problems, for whom the cardiovascular strain of prolonged heat can be the thing that tips them over. And, critically, anyone without air conditioning, because if the air outside never cools and you have no way to cool the air inside, then your home stops being a shelter and becomes a trap. This is the part where I want to talk directly to you, because unlike a lot of what we cover on this channel, this is something you can actually do something about tonight. If you know someone in the affected region, someone older, someone living alone, someone whose air conditioning is unreliable or non-existent, check on them, not with a text, in person, or at least a phone call where you actually hear how they are doing. The 1995 Chicago disaster was made so much worse by social isolation, by vulnerable people who had no one checking on them, no one to notice they were in trouble until it was too late. A single knock on a door can be the difference. That is not me being dramatic. That is the documented lesson of every deadly heatwave we have ever studied. Let me add one more layer to why the warm nights are so physiologically brutal, because there is a specific piece of biology here that most people never learn. When your body is fighting heat, one of its main tools is to move blood toward the skin, where it can shed warmth into the surrounding air. To do that, your heart has to work harder, pumping more blood to the surface, and your cardiovascular system spends the whole hot day under elevated strain. On a normal night, that strain lets up. The air cools, the demand to dump heat eases, and your heart gets to downshift and rest. But when the night stays at 75 degrees, the demand never eases. Your cardiovascular system stays under load, hour after hour, through the night and into the next day with no break. For a young, healthy person, that is exhausting. For an older person, or someone with existing heart disease, that unbroken strain is exactly the kind of thing that triggers a cardiac event. This is why the death statistics from heat waves are dominated not by people collapsing dramatically in the afternoon sun, but by vulnerable people whose overtaxed systems simply give out, often at night, often indoors. The warm night is not a lesser danger than the hot day. In many ways it is the greater one, and there is a cruel geography to who gets hurt, one that shows up in every deadly heat wave we have ever studied. Cities hold heat worse than the countryside, because all that brick and concrete and asphalt and rooftop absorbs the sun's energy all day and then radiates it back out slowly through the night, keeping the urban air warmer than the surrounding land. We call this the urban heat island, and it means that the very places with the most people are also the places where the nights cool the least. Layer onto that the reality that the people most exposed are often those with the fewest resources, older residents on fixed incomes who cannot afford to run air conditioning around the clock, people in older buildings without central cooling, people living alone with no one to check on them. The heat does not fall evenly. It concentrates on exactly the people least able to escape it. That is not a natural law. It is a solvable problem, and it is why the single most useful thing in this entire forecast is not a piece of data at all. It is the reminder to go knock on a door. Because I want to connect this all the way back to the dome one more time, so the physiology does not float free of the meteorology. Every bit of this danger, the compounding heat, the unbroken cardiovascular strain, the nights that hold at 75, exists because the dome will not move. A dome that moved on would let the nights cool and let bodies reset. A stuck dome forecloses the reset, and the foreclosed reset is what fills hospitals. So when you hear that this ridge is stalled, do not file that under boring meteorological detail. The stalling is the mechanism of the harm. It is the reason the warm nights are on the table at all, and the warm nights are the reason a heat wave becomes a death toll. And here is where the story has to widen back out, because so far we have talked about the heat as if it were the whole disaster. It is not. It is only the first face of the dome. Everything I have just described, the records, the warm nights, the danger to vulnerable people, is unfolding on top of a landscape that was already in serious trouble before the heat ever arrived. Because you cannot understand why this dome is so dangerous until you understand what it is baking down onto. The ground underneath this heat was not healthy, well-watered country. It was already parched, it was already cracking, and a stuck dome sinking onto already dry land does something very different and much worse than the same dome sinking onto a wet one. To see the second face of this thing, we have to look down at the soil itself and at just how much of this country was already running out of water before the first record even fell. Part 4. The ground was already dry. The dome does not sink onto a blank slate. It sinks onto whatever is already there, and what is already there this weekend, across a huge fraction of the country, is drought. Not a mild, dry spell. Not a lawn that needs watering. Serious, entrenched, soil-cracking drought that was gripping this land before the heat ever showed up, and that the heat is now going to make dramatically worse. This is the second face of our one-stuck dome, and to understand why the heat and the drought are really the same story, you have to understand a vicious little feedback loop that ties them together. Let me give you the raw scale of it first. As of the most recent United States Drought Monitor, nearly 30% of the continental United States, 29.99% to be exact, is in what is classified as severe drought or worse. Severe drought is the category they label D2, and it is the point at which you start seeing real damage, crop losses, water restrictions, streams running low. Beyond that, more than 11% of the country, 11.23%, is in extreme drought, D3, which is worse still, and a sliver, just under 1%, has reached D4, the exceptional category, which is the most severe classification that exists on the entire scale. There is nothing above D4. When a place hits exceptional drought, it has run out of categories to describe how dry it is. Now, I have to be honest with you about one wrinkle in these numbers, because intellectual honesty is the whole point of this channel, and the drought map has a genuinely counterintuitive feature this week. The amount of the country in severe drought actually ticked down slightly, by about 0.7 of a percentage point, compared to the week before. So if you just glanced at that single national number, you might conclude that the drought is easing. But that would be exactly the wrong lesson, and here is why. That national figure is an average, and averages hide divergence. The eastern half of the country has been getting rain, real, drought-busting rain, which we will actually come back to later in this video because that rain is its own kind of dangerous. So the east is improving, but the west, the exact region sitting under our stuck dome, is drying out further. When you average an improving east against a worsening west, you can get a national number that drifts down even as the fire country, the part of the map that matters most this weekend, gets worse. The single number lies. You have to look at where the drought actually is, and where it is precisely underneath the heat. So now let me tie the two faces together, the heat and the drought, because this is the part that most coverage completely misses. Heat and drought are not two separate problems that happen to be occurring in the same place. They feed each other, in a loop, and once you see the loop you cannot unsee it. It works like this. Start with dry soil. When soil has moisture in it, a lot of the sun's energy that hits the ground goes into evaporating that water. Evaporation is a cooling process. The same way sweat cools your skin, so moist soil actually air conditions the landscape above it. The energy that would have heated the air goes into turning water into vapor instead, and the air stays a little cooler, but when the soil is already dry, there is no water to evaporate. So all of that solar energy, every bit of it, goes straight into heating the ground and the air above it. Nothing gets used up cooling. The heat just builds. And here is where the loop closes and becomes vicious. That extra heat, the heat you get because the dry soil could not cool itself, then reaches back down and dries the soil out even further. Hotter air pulls moisture out of the ground and out of the plants faster, a process scientists call evaporative demand, or sometimes more vividly atmospheric thirst. A hotter atmosphere is a thirstier atmosphere, and a thirstier atmosphere sucks the remaining moisture out of an already dry landscape even more aggressively. So dry soil makes more heat, and more heat makes drier soil, and drier soil makes even more heat, around and around, each turn of the loop tightening the next. This is why a stuck dome over already dry country is so much more dangerous than the same dome over wet country. On wet land, the dome has to fight the cooling effect of all that evaporating soil moisture. On dry land, there is nothing to fight. The dome and the drought amplify each other, and the whole system spirals hotter and drier together. And this is why forecasters watch soil moisture almost as closely as they watch the ridge itself, because the state of the ground is what determines how much of the dome's energy becomes heat, rather than evaporation. Over wet soil, a strong ridge produces a hot but survivable stretch, because the moisture keeps siphoning off energy and taking the edge off the peak. Over the dry, drought-stricken soil we have this weekend, that safety valve is gone, and the same ridge produces something far more extreme. So the drought is not a separate hazard sitting beside the heat. It is the thing that decides how dangerous the heat becomes, by controlling whether the ground can defend itself at all. This weekend, across the region under the dome, the ground cannot. The safety valve is closed, and the heat is free to run. That is the direct physical reason our central thread holds. One dome, three faces, each face making the others worse. The heat is deepening the drought right now this weekend in real time by baking the last moisture out of soil that was already gasping. And the drought is deepening the heat right back, by removing the evaporative cooling that would otherwise have taken the edge off. They are not neighbours. They are the same machine, running in a loop under the same lid that will not move. I want to make the D4 category, the exceptional one, feel as serious as it actually is, because it is easy to hear a small percentage and shrug. Just under 1% of the continental United States is in exceptional drought right now. 1% sounds tiny. But remember the scale we are talking about. The continental United States is enormous, and 1% of it is still a vast stretch of land. And more importantly, exceptional drought is not spread thinly across that area. It is concentrated in the driest pockets of the West, exactly where the fires are. Exceptional drought means the widespread failure of crops and pasture, the drying up of streams and wells, water emergencies and vegetation so desiccated that it becomes tinder. When a landscape hits D4, it has crossed into a state where the normal defences against fire, the moisture in the living plants themselves, have essentially been removed. And the dome we have been describing is sitting right on top of those pockets, baking them further. So that small-sounding percentage is not reassuring at all. It is the hard core of the fuel bed, the place where the next big fire is most likely to find everything it needs. There is also a longer arc dimension to this drought that the weekly numbers do not capture, and it matters for understanding why the West in particular is so primed. Much of the interior West has been running dry not just for weeks or months, but, in a broader sense, for years. drawing down the deep reserves that a landscape leans on when the surface goes dry, the soil moisture at depth, the reservoirs, the snowpack that feeds the rivers through the summer. When those deep reserves are already depleted, a hot, dry spell like this one does not just scratch the surface. It reaches into a landscape that has no buffer left, no cushion of stored water to blunt the impact. That is why the same dome can do so much more damage in the west this year than it might have in a wetter one. It is not starting from full, it is starting from empty, and a dome sinking onto an already emptied landscape has nothing to fight and everything to dry. And this is the point where the drought stops being an abstract map of colours and starts being the direct explanation for the fire and the heat we have already discussed, and the fire we are about to. Dry soil made the heat worse by removing the evaporative cooling. Dry vegetation is about to make the fire worse by handing it a landscape of ready fuel. The drought is the connective tissue, the thing that links phase 1 to phase 3, and it is being deepened this weekend in real time by the very dome that is threatening the records. When you see it that way, the drought is not a side story at all. It is the mechanism by which the heat becomes fire. There is one more amplifier layered underneath all of this, and it has to do with the state of the whole Pacific Ocean and the temperature of the entire atmosphere. But I am going to hold most of that for later because it deserves its own careful treatment. For now, just know that this drought is not happening on a neutral background. It is happening on a warmed one, and a warmed atmosphere is, by the basic physics of it, a thirstier one, which tilts the entire system toward drying out faster than it otherwise would. We covered the drought itself in much more detail in our video from a few days ago, when the drought was the whole story rather than one face of a larger one, and if you want the deep dive on how a continental drought builds and what it means for the country's water supply, that video is the place to go. Today, the drought is not the headline, it is the fuel bed, and that word fuel is not a metaphor. Because here is what all of this dryness actually produces when you hold a stuck dome over it long enough. It produces landscape that is not just thirsty but flammable. Every dry week that passes pulls more moisture out of the grasses and the brush and the timber until the vegetation across huge stretches of the west stops being living plants that resist burning and starts being cured fuel that ignites at the touch of a spark. The drought is the reason the land is dry. The heat is the reason it is getting drier. And the two of them together have turned the interior west into something that is not waiting to burn. It is already burning. 10 large fires are already on the map as I'm talking to you, and the same dome that is breaking heat records is about to make every one of them harder to fight. To see the third face of this thing, we have to go to the fire lines. Part 5. The West is already burning. The third face of the dome is fire, and unlike the heat records that are still a forecast and the drought that builds slowly over weeks, the fire is already here, right now, burning tonight. There are 10 large wildfires actively burning across the interior west as I record this, and I want to take you to the biggest of them, because the numbers tell you everything about what a stuck dome over cured fuel actually produces. The largest active fire in the country right now is the Babylon Fire in Utah, and it has burned 103,633 acres. Let me put that in terms you can actually picture, because 100,000 acres is one of those numbers that just washes over you. 103,000 acres is more than 160 square miles. It is a burning footprint larger than many major cities, and it is 44% contained, which means that after all the crews and aircraft and effort thrown at it, more than half of its perimeter is still open, still active, still capable of running. In Colorado, the Aspen Acres fire has burned 97,083 acres and stands at 28% contained, and also in Colorado the Gold Mountain fire is only 7% contained. 7%. That is a fire that is, for all practical purposes, still running nearly free, with barely a fingernail of its edge held. Now connect this straight back to what we just talked about, because these fires did not come from nowhere. They are burning in the exact fuels that the drought dried out and the heat cured. Remember the feedback loop from a moment ago, dry soil making more heat, and more heat making drier soil. The end product of that loop, when it runs long enough across a forest or a range of grassland, is vegetation so stripped of moisture that it ignites easily and burns hot and fast. The The drought built the fuel bed, the heat lit the match, or at least primed everything so that any match would do. And now the very same dome that is threatening the all-time records in Salt Lake City and Billings is sitting directly over these fire lines, and it is about to make all of them worse. Here is how the dome worsens the fire specifically, because it is not vague, it is mechanical. That same sinking, compressing, drying air that is heating the cities is also reaching down onto the fires and pulling even more moisture out of the fuels, making them more flammable by the hour. The heat raises the temperature of the vegetation, so it takes less energy to bring it to ignition. And the suppressed humidity that comes with the dome means the air itself is parched, which lets fires spread faster and makes them harder to knock down. Firefighters talk about fire behavior, the way a fire moves and grows and resists control, and everything about a heat dome pushes fire behavior in the wrong direction. Hotter, drier, faster, meaner. The incoming peak of this dome is forecast to worsen fire behavior across the entire region, which means the containment numbers you just heard, the 44% and the 28% and the 7%, are numbers that could get worse before they get better. And it is not just the fires already burning, it is the conditions for new ones, which right now are about as bad as they get. There is an elevated fire weather risk stretching from central Oregon all the way down into Utah, and the ingredients are textbook dangerous. West-southwest winds of 20 to 40 miles an hour, and relative humidity crashing down to between 5 and 15%. Let me make sure that second number lands, because 5 to 15% humidity is extraordinarily dry. That is desert air dry, the kind of air that pulls moisture out of everything it touches, including living plants and including your own skin and lungs. When you combine air that dry with wind that strong over fuel that cured, you get a landscape where any spark at all, a dragging chain, a piece of equipment, a lightning strike, a downed power line, can become a fast-moving wildfire in a matter of minutes. Not hours. Minutes. The margin between a quiet afternoon and a new 100,000-acre fire, under those conditions, is a single ignition. The official warnings reflect exactly this danger. There are red flag warnings in effect across Wyoming, in the Bighorn Basin and around Casper, where the combination of low humidity, hot temperatures, and gusts up to 35 miles an hour could produce erratic fire behavior. A red flag warning is the fire equivalent of the extreme heat. Warning we talked about earlier, the Weather Service telling you the conditions are critical, and a fire that starts will be very hard to stop, and it is not just the lower 48. There are 2 red flag warnings up in the interior of Alaska, in the upper Koyukuk Valley and the Yukon Flats, issued for lightning, with humidity as low as 25 to 30% and outflow wind gusts reaching 50 miles an hour. High-latitude fire weather like that so far north is its own kind of unsettling signal about how widely this dry, hot pattern is reaching. There is even a red flag warning down in portions of southern and western Puerto Rico. From the Alaskan interior to a Caribbean island, the fire weather map is lit up. There is a detail in the moisture picture that captures the whole strange split of this pattern in a single frame, and it involves the same tropical moisture we will look at more closely later. Even as the Great Basin sits bone dry under critical fire weather, more tropical moisture is being pulled into the nearby Four Corners region, enough to fire off slow-moving storms that could drop localized flooding. So within a relatively short distance, you have the ingredients for a flash flood on one side and a fast-moving wildfire on the other, both under the influence of the same restless, amplified atmosphere. That juxtaposition, water and fire almost close enough to see each other, is the West summer signature taken to an extreme, and it is a preview of a larger split we will come back to. For now, the point is simply that the fire side of this dome is not softening. The air over the fuels is staying dry and windy, the fires already burning are being pushed toward worse behavior, and the conditions for new ignitions are as primed as they get. I also want to underscore how the dome connects the fire directly back to the record heat in the cities, because it is easy to picture the fires as a separate regional problem happening off in the mountains somewhere, disconnected from the urban record chase. They are not disconnected, they are the same air. The subsiding, drying, superheated air under the dome that is pushing Salt Lake City and Billings toward their all-time marks is the very same air mass sitting over the fire lines, lowering the humidity, curing the fuels, and stiffening the winds. When the dome intensifies to break the city records on Sunday, that intensification is felt on the fire lines too, as worse conditions on the same day. The record and the fire are not two events on one map. They are one air mass doing two things, and the day it does one worst is the day it does the other worst. That simultaneity, driven by the single dome, is the whole reason this is a triple threat, and not three separate coincidences. I want to bring back one image from earlier in this video, because it is the perfect illustration of how tightly these faces are bound together. Remember Lytton, British Columbia, in 2021. That town set the all-time heat record for an entire country, 49.6 degrees Celsius, 121.3 degrees Fahrenheit, and then the very next day it burned to the ground. That is not two separate stories. That is one dome producing the record and the fire in the same place within 24 hours of each other. It is the clearest proof we have that the heat and the fire are the same event wearing two faces, and it is exactly the pattern we are watching set up again this weekend, a stuck dome breaking records over cities while sitting on top of a landscape already in flames. I want to slow down on that 5 to 15% humidity number, because it is one of those figures that sounds technical but actually describes something you can feel in your body, and it explains why fire crews dread these conditions. Relative humidity is a measure of how much moisture the air is holding compared to how much it could hold. When it drops to 5 or 10%, the air is desperately dry, and dry air is greedy. It pulls moisture out of anything that has it. It pulls it out of the fine grasses and the dead leaves and the small twigs, the fuels that ignite first and carry fire fastest, until they are dry enough to catch from a single ember. It even pulls moisture out of the larger fuels, the brush and the timber, lowering the threshold at which they will burn. So when firefighters see the humidity forecast to crash into the single digits, they know that the landscape is about to become maximally receptive to fire, and that anything that starts will start easily and spread fast. Combine that with wind, and you have the two ingredients that turn a spark into a running fire. The dome supplies the dryness. The circulation around it supplies the wind. Together they are a recipe, and I want to be clear about how the containment numbers actually work, because they are easy to misread. When you hear that a fire is 44% contained, it does not mean 44% of the fire is out. It means that crews have established a secure control line, a boundary they are confident the fire will not cross, around 44% of its perimeter. The other 56% of the edge is still open, still active, still capable of advancing if the wind and the fuel and the weather line up. So a fire at 7% contained, like Gold Mountain, is a fire whose perimeter is almost entirely unsecured, a fire that is for practical purposes still finding its own edges. And now imagine what a strengthening heat dome does to those numbers. It dries the fuels ahead of the fire, it lowers the humidity, it can stir the winds, and every one of those effects makes the open perimeter harder to hold and easier for the fire to push past. The dome does not just threaten new fires, it actively works against the crews trying to contain the ones already burning. That is the mechanical link between the heat records in the cities and the fire lines in the mountains, the same air doing both. There is a human dimension to this that I do not want to skip past, because behind every one of these acreage figures are thousands of people on the lines. Fighting a large wildfire in extreme heat is one of the most punishing jobs there is. Crews work long shifts in heavy protective gear, in temperatures that are already dangerous before you add the radiant heat of the fire itself, breathing smoke, hauling equipment across steep terrain. When the dome pushes the ambient heat toward records, it does not only make the fire more aggressive, it makes the work of fighting it more dangerous and more exhausting for the people doing it, raising the risk of heat illness among the very crews we are counting on to hold those containment lines. So the heat is not a backdrop to the firefight. It is an active adversary in it, working against the fuels, against the containment, and against the firefighters all at once. So let me pull all three faces together in your mind before we go further, because we have now seen each of them separately, and it is time to see them as one. We have the heat, threatening all-time records in Salt Lake City and Billings, made deadly by nights that will not cool. We have the drought, gripping nearly a third of the country, drying the soil and curing the fuel and feeding the heat right back through that vicious loop. And we have the fire, 10 large blazes already burning, with critical fire weather primed for more, all of it about to be worsened by the very dome that is breaking the heat records. 3 faces, 1 dome. I have said that phrase several times now, and in the next part of this video I want to actually prove it to you, to show you the mechanism by which a single feature in the sky can orchestrate all 3 at once, because once you see the machine clearly, you will understand why this weekend is not 3 coincidental disasters, but 1, and why the people who study this for a living are watching it with the particular unease of experts who recognize a pattern. Part 6. 1 system, 3 faces. We have always been taught to read the news as a list. Here is the heat story. Here is the drought story. Here is the wildfire story. 3 separate items, 3 separate headlines, filed in 3 separate mental folders. But what if that is exactly the wrong way to see this weekend? What if the heat and the drought and the fire are not 3 stories at all, but 1 story, told in 3 voices by a single feature in the sky? That is the claim this whole video is built around, and now I want to actually prove it to you, mechanism by mechanism, so that it stops being a slogan and becomes something you can see. Start with the dome as the organizing center, the thing everything else hangs from, a ridge of high pressure with heights above 594 decameters, parked and stalled over the western and north-central United States. That single feature is the cause, everything else is an effect. And the reason 1 cause can produce 3 effects is that the dome does not do just 1 thing to the air beneath it. It does several things simultaneously, and each of those things becomes one of the faces. The dome sinks air, and sinking air compresses and heats. That is face number 1, the heat, the direct thermal product of subsidence under a strong ridge. The dome suppresses clouds and lets sunlight pour down unobstructed, which intensifies the heating and adds another layer to face number 1. But that same relentless sun and sinking hot air also accelerates evaporation from the soil, pulling moisture out of ground that was already dry, and that is face number 2, the drought, deepening in real time as the dome bakes the last water out of the land. And the dried-out, heat-cured vegetation that results, combined with the low humidity and the wind around the dome's edges, is face number 3, the fire, the flammable end product of a landscape that the dome has wrung dry. 1 feature, 3 outputs, all at once. Now here is the part that elevates this from a coincidence to a genuine system, and it is the feedback we touched on earlier, so let me make it explicit and complete. The 3 faces do not just coexist, they reinforce each other. The heat deepens the drought by accelerating evaporation. The drought deepens the heat by removing the evaporative cooling that moist soil would have provided. So more of the sun's energy goes straight into raising the temperature. That hotter, drier air then cures the fuels further, worsening the fire risk. And the fires themselves, through the smoke and the scorched ground they leave behind, can even feed back into the atmosphere in ways that help sustain the very ridge overhead. It is a self-amplifying cycle. Each face makes the next one worse, and the whole system spirals in one direction, hotter and drier and more flammable, for as long as the dome refuses to move. That is why I keep coming back to the fact that it is stuck. A dome that moves on is a bad day. A dome that stalls is a spiral. And this is exactly why the all-time records are so significant, beyond the simple shock of the numbers. When Salt Lake City threatens 107 degrees and Billings threatens 108, those figures are not just impressive trivia. They are the loudest signal the atmosphere can send us about how extreme the underlying system has become. You do not challenge the hottest temperature in a city's entire recorded history with a run-of-the-mill ridge. You do it with a dome strong enough and stuck enough to drive the whole 3-face spiral to its limit. The records are the readout. They are the number on the dial that tells you the machine is running near its maximum. And the same machine that pushes that dial toward the all-time record is the machine drying the soil to exceptional drought levels and priming the fuels for the fires. The record and the drought and the fire are all the same needle on the same gauge, just read in different units. There is a phrase forecasters sometimes use for a setup like this, a compound event. and it is worth defining because it captures precisely what makes this weekend more than the sum of its parts. A compound event is one in which multiple hazards occur together, in the same place or time, in a way that makes the combined impact worse than any of them would be alone. Heat during a fire is worse than heat alone, because it endangers the firefighters and dries the fuels. Drought during heat is worse than drought alone, because it removes the cooling that would have blunted the heat. Fire during drought is worse than fire alone, because the fuels are primed to carry it. Each hazard amplifies the others, so the total danger is not additive, it is multiplicative. And a compound event driven by a single stuck dome is the most coherent kind, because there is one cause orchestrating all the pieces in concert, rather than several unrelated hazards happening to collide by chance. That coherence is exactly why this weekend reads as one system. The hazards are not colliding by accident. They are being conducted by the same baton. And understanding it as one system is not just an intellectual nicety. It changes how you should think about the risk, because it means the hazards will not politely take turns. In an ordinary week, you might get a hot day, then later a dry stretch, then eventually some fire risk, each arriving and departing on its own schedule, each manageable in isolation. A compound event under a stuck dome does not work that way. It delivers all of them at once to overlapping regions, straining every response system simultaneously, the heat health responders and the firefighters and the emergency managers all working the same days over the same ground. Resources that could be moved to fight a fire in a normal week are needed to run cooling centres in this one. The simultaneity is itself a hazard, a multiplier on top of the individual threats, and it is the direct product of one cause driving everything at the same time. That is the practical cost of a system as opposed to a sequence. Let me make this concrete with a single mental image that ties the whole system into one frame. Picture the map of the western United States this weekend. In the cities, thermometers are climbing toward numbers no one alive there has ever seen. In the soil beneath those same cities and the country around them, moisture is being pulled out faster than any rain could replace it, deepening a drought that already covers nearly a third of the nation. And scattered across that same parched landscape, 10 large fires are burning, with the conditions for more of them primed and waiting for a spark from the Oregon high country down through Utah. Now zoom out and see the one thing sitting on top of all of it, the dome. Not 3 maps, one map, with one feature, producing 3 simultaneous emergencies. That is the picture. That is the whole story of this weekend in a single image. This is also why the experts who study this are uneasy in a specific recognizable way, and I want to name that unease honestly rather than dress it up. It is not that a hot weekend is unprecedented. Hot weekends happen. It is that the combination, the stacking, the simultaneity, is the signature of a pattern that seems to be showing up more often. A dome that gets strong, gets stuck, and drives all 3 faces at once, on a landscape and an atmosphere that are, for reasons we will get to, more primed to let it happen than they used to be. When a meteorologist looks at this setup, they are not just seeing this weekend, they are seeing a template, and they are wondering how often that template is going to keep printing. Let me push on the feedback idea a little harder, because feedback loops are the most important and least intuitive concept in all of this, and if you really grasp it, you will understand why these events can escalate so quickly and so far. Most of the systems we deal with in daily life are self-correcting. Push them, and they push back toward the middle. A ball at the bottom of a bowl, nudged, rolls back to the center, but a feedback loop is the opposite. Push it, and it pushes further in the same direction, and the further it goes, the harder it pushes, so a small nudge can grow into a large excursion. The heat drought fire system is that second kind. A dry patch of soil makes a little extra heat, and the extra heat makes the soil a little drier, and the drier soil makes a little more heat, and each turn amplifies the next instead of damping it. This is why a dome that might, over wet ground, have produced merely a hot week can, over dry ground, spiral into a record-threatening fire-spawning event. The feedback took a moderate push and ran with it, and the stalling is what gives the feedback time to run. A dome that moved on would interrupt the loop before it could spiral. A stuck dome lets it turn and turn and turn. I think it helps to name what makes this weekend different from the ordinary run of summer weather, because domes of high pressure are not rare, and hot spells happen every year, and I do not want you to come away thinking every warm weekend is a 3-faced emergency. The difference is in 3 properties stacking together. First, strength. a ridge anomalous enough to push surface temperatures toward all-time records rather than ordinary daily ones. Second, persistence, a stall that lets the heat compound and the feedback loop spiral instead of passing through in a day. And third, the state of the land underneath, a landscape already dried to the point of active fire, so the dome lands on primed fuel rather than green, wet country. Any one of those alone is a hot spell. All three together, strong and stuck and overprimed land, is what produces the signature we are watching this weekend. It is the combination, not any single ingredient, that turns weather into a system and a system into a warning. And that combination is exactly why the people who study this for a living are watching with the particular unease I described. It is not the strength alone, which they have seen before. It is not the stall alone, or the dry land alone. It is the way all three keep showing up together, the way the template keeps printing that unsettles them. Because a one-off is just weather. A pattern that recurs is something else. When an expert looks at this dome, part of what they are seeing is the memory of the last several times a strong ridge stalled over primed land and drove the whole spiral, and part of what they are feeling is the question of how often this particular combination is going to keep assembling itself. That is the difference between reading the forecast and reading the pattern, and it is the difference between being alarmed by this weekend and being alarmed by what this weekend might represent. Because here is the thing that should genuinely give you pause. If this were purely a story about the West baking under a dome, that would be alarming enough. But the same enormous buckled, stalled pattern in the atmosphere that is producing the heat and the drought and the fire out west is not confined to the west. A big stuck wave in the jet stream does not only create a ridge, on the other side of that wave, it creates the opposite. And that means, at the very same time this dome is drying half the country, to the point of exceptional drought and active fire, the same overall pattern is doing something that looks like the exact reverse somewhere else. There are places, this very weekend, where the danger is not too little water. It is far too much, and understanding how one atmospheric pattern can drown one region, while it incinerates another, is the key to seeing just how big and how stuck this thing really is. Let me show you the other side of the wave. Part 7. The Same Sky. Drowning. Here is something that sounds like a contradiction, but is actually the most honest illustration of how big this pattern is. At the very same time that our stuck dome is drying the west to the point of active wildfire, the same overall atmospheric pattern is producing dangerous flooding elsewhere. One system. Fire on one edge, floods on the other. And once you understand why, you understand that the drought and the deluge are not opposites at all. They are two products of the same buckled, stalled sky. Think back to that big wave in the jet stream, the one that buckled and stalled and trapped our dome inside its northward bulge. A wave has two sides. Where it bulges north, you get the ridge, the dome, the sinking hot air, the drought and the fire. But on the flip side of that same wave, the air is doing the opposite. It is rising, cooling and wringing out its moisture as rain. So the very same distortion of the jet stream that builds the dome over the west sets up the machinery for heavy rain on its margins. The dryness and the wetness are not two separate weather stories that happen to be occurring at once. They are the two halves of a single stuck wave. You can see it right at the dome's own doorstep. More tropical moisture is being pulled up into the Four Corners region and the Great Basin, loading the atmosphere with more than 1.25 inches of what meteorologists call precipitable water, which is a measure of how much moisture is available to fall as rain. That moisture is firing off slow-moving storms capable of dropping localized flash flooding. And here is the almost surreal part. Just to the north and west of where those storms are flooding, the Great Basin is bone dry and under critical fire weather. You could, in principle, stand in one spot and watch a flash flood, and drive a short distance and smell the smoke of a new wildfire. Too much water and far too little, side by side, both produced by the same restless, amplified atmosphere. And then, well to the east, the pattern's wet side has been on full display in a much bigger way. Across the mid-Mississippi Valley, the Ohio and Tennessee valleys, and up into the central Appalachians, storms have been setting up and repeating over the same ground. A process forecasters call training, because the storm cells pass over one location one after another, like railroad cars running down the same stretch of track. When storms train like that, the rain does not get spread out. It piles up in one place. Some areas have seen 3 to 5 inches of rain fall in a matter of hours, on ground that in many cases was already saturated from earlier rounds. Numerous flood warnings and flash flood warnings have been active across Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. Creeks jumping their banks, water rising over roads, the whole grim vocabulary of a flash flood. Now, why does this matter for our central story? The story of the dome and its three faces out west? Because it is the proof of scale. The reason the east is drowning is directly connected to the reason the west is baking. It is the same stuck pattern. When you see the flooding in Kentucky and the fires in Utah as two separate news items, you miss the single most important fact about this weekend, which is that they are being generated by one enormous jammed configuration of the atmosphere. The dome is not a local event. It is one lobe of a continent-spanning distortion, and that distortion is dumping water on one side of the country, while it wrings the water out of the other. The scale of the wet side tells you the scale of the dry side. They are the same size because they are the same thing. There is also a deeper reason the two extremes are showing up together, and it goes back to something I promised we would return to, the state of the atmosphere as a whole. A warmer atmosphere holds more water vapour. That single fact loads the dice on both ends. On the wet side of the wave, there is more moisture available to dump as extreme rainfall, so when the storms train, they train harder and drop more. On the dry side, that same warmth means a thirstier atmosphere, pulling moisture out of the soil faster and deepening the drought. The same underlying condition intensifies both the flood and the drought at once. It is not that the atmosphere can't make up its mind. It is that a warmer atmosphere makes both extremes more extreme, and a stuck wave then parks one extreme over one region and the other extreme over another and holds them both in place. The training storm mechanism deserves a closer look, because it is one of the most dangerous things the atmosphere does, and most people have never heard the term. Normally, when a thunderstorm forms, the winds carry it along, so it drops its rain over a moving path and no single spot gets hit for too long. But under certain configurations, the winds line up in such a way that new storm cells keep forming at the same upwind point and travelling along the same track, one after another, like train cars passing over the same stretch of rail. Each cell dumps its rain on the same ground the last one just soaked. The rain does not spread out, it concentrates, and that is how you get 3, 4, 5 inches falling on one location in a matter of hours, on soil that is already saturated and cannot absorb another drop, which is exactly the recipe for a flash flood. It is the wet side mirror of the training we saw in the dry side spiral, the same idea of the atmosphere repeating over one spot instead of moving on, and it produces the opposite disaster. And notice the deep symmetry here, because it is the whole point. On the dry side, the danger comes from the atmosphere refusing to deliver water and the dome refusing to move. On the wet side, the danger comes from the atmosphere delivering too much water to one spot and the storms refusing to move. Both are failures of movement. Both are what happens when a stuck pattern parks a process over one place and holds it there. The west bakes because the dome stalls, the east floods because the storms stall. Same underlying pathology, a jammed atmosphere that will not let its processes progress the way they normally do, expressed as opposite extremes on opposite sides of the same stuck wave. When you see that symmetry, you stop thinking of the heat and the floods as two stories and start seeing them as one, and that is the single most important shift in understanding this whole weekend. I also want to be honest that the flooding is its own serious hazard, not just a rhetorical device for illustrating the dome. Flash floods are among the deadliest weather events there are, precisely because they come up fast and because water is so much heavier and more powerful than people intuitively expect. It takes surprisingly little moving water to sweep a car off a road or knock a person off their feet, and the regions in the storm's path, across parts of Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia, have real people facing real danger from rising creeks and streams this weekend. So this is not a footnote to feel clever about. It is a genuine threat to a different set of Americans, produced by the same stuck sky that is threatening the record book cities out west. One pattern, two coasts of danger, water everywhere and water nowhere, all at once. So the flooding is not a detour from our story. It is the mirror image of it, the same dome and the same stalled wave seen from the other side. And it reinforces the thing I most want you to take away from this weekend, which is that we are not watching a collection of unrelated disasters. We are watching one pattern, one buckled and jammed sky, express itself as heat and drought and fire in one place, and as floods in another, all at the same time. That is what a truly stuck pattern looks like when you finally see the whole of it at once. But recognizing that this is one system raises a much harder and more important question, and it is the one that separates a passing weather event from a genuine warning. Is this kind of stuck, extreme, everything at once pattern just bad luck this particular July, a roll of the dice that happened to come up ugly? Or is there something about the state of the planet right now, about the ocean and the atmosphere and the baseline we're all living on, that is loading those dice, making patterns like this one more likely, more intense, and more prone to getting stuck? Because if it is just luck, we can shrug and wait for it to pass. But if the dice are loaded, then this weekend is not an anomaly. It is a preview. And to know which it is, we have to look at the background conditions underneath the whole thing. Part 8. The loaded dice. So which is it? Bad luck or loaded dice? To answer that honestly, we have to look at the background conditions the whole weekend is playing out on, because a dome does not form in a vacuum. It forms on top of an ocean state and an atmospheric baseline, and both of those, right now, are tilted in a direction that makes an event like this more likely and more intense. Start with the ocean, because it sets the table for everything. Out in the Pacific, we're in the middle of an El Niño, the periodic warming of the surface waters across the tropical Pacific that ripples out to reshape weather patterns around the entire planet. And this El Niño is strengthening and doing it quickly. The index scientists use to track it, the Oceanic Niño Index, sits at plus 0.98 for the most recent 3-month season. That is up from plus 0.51 the season before. In other words, in a single season, it nearly doubled. That is a fast, notable intensification, and it matters because a warmer Pacific tilts the odds across North America towards certain patterns, including hot and dry conditions across parts of the country, and generally injects more energy into the atmosphere for both extremes we have been talking about. The El Niño is not directly causing this specific dome, but it is part of the tilted table the dome is sitting on. Then there is the atmospheric baseline itself, and this is where a single, simple piece of physics does an enormous amount of the explanatory work. A warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor. The relationship is well understood and it is not small, roughly 7% more moisture holding capacity for every additional degree Celsius of warming. This is called the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship, and it is one of the most reliable equations in all of atmospheric science. Now think about what that does to our three faces. On the dry side, a warmer, thirstier atmosphere pulls moisture out of the soil faster, so droughts set in quicker and go deeper. On the heat side, a warmer baseline means every dome starts from a higher floor, so the same atmospheric setup reaches a higher peak. And on the wet side, which we just saw in the flooding, that extra moisture holding capacity means the storms that do form have more water to dump. The baseline loads all three faces at once. That is what people mean when they say the dice are loaded. The dome is still the thing that rolls the dice, but the dice themselves have been weighted toward the extreme. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of place where it is easy to overstate. No single weekend, no single dome is proof of anything by itself. Weather is noisy. Extreme events have always happened. The honest scientific position is not that this specific event was caused by the warmed baseline, but that the warmed baseline makes events like this one more likely and more severe than they would otherwise be. That is a subtler claim, and a stronger one, because it does not rest on any single roll of the dice. It rests on the shape of the whole distribution. And this is where history becomes genuinely useful, because we can look back and see what stuck domes over dry land have done before, on baselines both cooler and warmer than today's. The obvious ancestor is the 1930s, the Dust Bowl decade, when stuck ridges of high pressure parked over the middle of the country, summer after summer, and produced heat and drought on a scale that reshaped American life. Many of the all-time state temperature records set during that decade still stand today. North Dakota's state record, 121 degrees, was set at a place called Steele in July of 1936, during one of those Dust Bowl heat waves. When we talk this weekend about the northern plains threatening all-time records, we're talking about challenging numbers that in some cases were set during the single, most brutal heat and drought decade in the country's recorded history. That is the company this dome is keeping. There are more recent analogues too. The heat and drought of 1980 and again 1988, both driven by stuck summer ridges, produce simultaneous heat waves and agricultural catastrophes across the central United States. And then there is the one we keep coming back to, the 2021 Pacific Northwest Heat Dome, which is the clearest modern demonstration of the whole three-phase spiral in action. A stalled ridge, all-time records shattered across the region, hundreds of deaths concentrated in the warm nights, and the town of Lytton setting a national record before burning down the next day. That event happened on today's warmed baseline, not the Dust Bowls, and it broke records by margins that stunned the scientists studying it. It is the template for what a stuck dome over primed land can do in the present climate, and it is exactly the kind of event the loaded dice make more probable. So, bad luck or loaded dice? The honest answer is both, braided together. This specific dome, sitting exactly where it is, stalling exactly when it did, is partly the luck of the atmospheric draw. Domes form and stall for reasons rooted in the chaotic dynamics of the jet stream, and you cannot pin any one of them entirely on the background. But the severity it is reaching, the all-time records it is threatening, the speed at which it is deepening the drought and curing the fuels, all of that is amplified by a table that has been tilted, an ocean that is warming, and an atmosphere that holds more heat and more moisture than it used to. The dice are the weather, the weighting is the baseline, and this weekend both are pushing in the same direction. Let me put the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship into a picture, because it is genuinely one of the most consequential facts in all of climate science, and it is not hard to grasp once you see it. Imagine the atmosphere as a sponge. A cold sponge can only hold so much water. Warm that sponge, and it can hold more, and the relationship is steep, about 7% more capacity for every additional degree Celsius. Now, a sponge that can hold more water will, when conditions are dry, pull more water out of whatever it touches, which on the ground means pulling moisture out of soil and plants faster and deepening droughts. And that same sponge, when conditions are wet, has more water available to wring out, which means heavier downpours when it does rain. So the same single change, a warmer atmosphere with more capacity, makes the dry places drier and the wet places wetter. This is why we keep seeing drought and flood intensify together, rather than one replacing the other. It is not a paradox. It is a sponge that got bigger, doing more of both. I keep coming back to the 1930s because the parallel is so instructive, and I want to draw it out a little more. The Dust Bowl was not a single bad summer. It was a decade in which stuck ridges kept setting up over the middle of the country, year after year, drying the soil until it literally lifted off the ground and blew away in enormous dark clouds. The heat records from that decade, including North Dakota's 121 degrees at Steele, in July of 1936, were products of exactly the kind of stalled, amplified pattern we are watching this weekend, just on a cooler background baseline. That is the sobering part. Those records were set on a cooler planet, by stuck domes over dried-out land, and this weekend we are threatening to approach some of them on a warmer planet, with the same kind of dome over the same kind of dried-out land. The ingredients are the same, the baseline is higher. That is what it means to say the dice are loaded, made concrete in the historical record. And the 2021 Pacific Northwest event is the one that should haunt anyone who studies this, because it happened in living memory on today's baseline, and it broke records not by a fraction of a degree, but by staggering margins, in some places shattering all-time marks by several degrees at once, which almost never happens. It killed hundreds. It produced the fire that erased a town the day after that town set a national heat record. Scientists who analysed it afterward found it to be so far outside the historical range that it forced a genuine reckoning with whether our models were capturing the full reach of what a stuck dome on a warmed baseline could do. It was, in effect, a demonstration that the extreme tail of the distribution is longer than we thought, that events we would have called nearly impossible are in fact possible. And it is precisely the kind of event the loaded dice make more likely, which is why the setup this weekend, another stalled dome over primed land, deserves to be watched with that memory firmly in mind. That honest, careful framing matters, because whenever an event like this shows up, so do the claims that try to explain it in ways that feel more satisfying than the truth. Some people look at a stuck, extreme everything-at-once dome and conclude that no natural pattern could do this, that someone must be making it happen. Others look at the same event and conclude that it is nothing at all, just summer, the records exaggerated, the whole thing overblown. Both of those reactions are wrong, but they are wrong in interesting and revealing ways, and they are worth taking seriously enough to actually examine. So let me tell you what people are saying about this dome, and let me tell you honestly whether science actually lands on each claim. Part 9. What people are saying. Every time a heat dome gets this extreme, the same theories come pouring out, and I think it is worth meeting them head-on rather than ignoring them, because some of them contain a grain of something real, and the honest thing to do is separate the grain from the chaff. So let me walk you through what people are saying about this dome, and whether science actually stands on each claim, because you deserve the real answer, not a dismissal and not an endorsement. The loudest claim, the one that surfaces whenever a heat wave gets severe enough, is that the dome was engineered, that someone, some agency, some hidden program, is manufacturing or steering this ridge of high pressure on purpose. You will hear names invoked: weather modification, cloud seeding, geoengineering. The claim usually goes that a dome this strong and this stuck cannot be natural, so it must be built. Now, I take this seriously enough to answer it properly, and the answer comes down to a single word: energy. The amount of energy stored and moved by a continental scale ridge of high pressure is almost incomprehensibly large. We're talking about a feature that spans thousands of miles and reorganizes the atmosphere over an entire half of a continent. The total energy involved dwarfs, by many orders of magnitude, anything that human weather modification technology can produce. It is not a close call. It is not that we could almost do it. It is that the gap between what a dome contains and what any existing technology can generate is a chasm. And cloud seeding, which is the one real weather modification technology in the mix, does something far more modest than the claim requires. Cloud seeding can, under the right conditions, nudge a little extra precipitation out of clouds that already exist and are already primed to rain. That is it. It cannot build a 594 decameter ridge. It cannot steer the jet stream. It cannot conjure a heat dome out of clear sky, or hold one in place over the west for a week. Asking cloud seeding to do that is like asking someone who can nudge a stalled car a few inches to move a mountain range. Different scale entirely. And the contrails you see behind aircraft, the ones that sometimes get folded into these theories, are just water vapor condensing in cold air. They are not the mechanism of a heat dome, so the engineered dome claim, examined honestly, runs straight into the physics and does not survive. There is no known mechanism by which existing technology could create or park this feature. The second claim is subtler, and this is the one that actually contains a grain of truth, so I want to give it its due. The claim is that the authorities are hiding how bad the water and heat crisis really is. Now, here is the honest part. There is a real, legitimate concern buried in there. The slow decline of aquifers and reservoirs, the long-term drawdown of the water that the West depends on, genuinely does get less attention than it deserves. It is a slow-motion story, and slow-motion stories do not make headlines, so they get underreported relative to their importance. And we saw earlier how a single national drought number can mask a regional emergency, how the improving East can hide the worsening West in an average. So the feeling that the full picture is not being adequately communicated is not crazy, but there is a world of difference between undercoverage and concealment. The drought monitor is public, updated every single week, and freely available to anyone. The temperature records are public. The fire acreages, the containment numbers, the forecast models, all public, all continuously updated, all free. Nothing is being hidden. The data is sitting right out in the open for anyone who wants to look. What is happening is not a cover-up. It is a failure of attention, and the cure for a failure of attention is exactly what we are doing right now, which is paying attention. The third claim comes from the opposite direction entirely, and it is just as wrong as the first, but it errs the other way. This is the claim that it is just summer, that the records are exaggerated, that the whole thing is overblown and there is nothing unusual happening at all. And I understand the instinct behind it, because heat waves do happen every summer, and a hot July is not by itself proof of anything, and there is a healthy skepticism in not panicking at every dramatic weather headline. But this claim collapses the moment you look at the specifics. We are not talking about an ordinary hot weekend. We are talking about cities threatening their all-time records, the hottest temperatures in their entire recorded histories. We are talking about temperatures running 15 to 25 degrees above normal. We are talking about all of it landing on a landscape where nearly a third of the country is already in severe drought and 10 large fires are already burning. That is not the signature of an ordinary summer. Calling it exaggerated requires ignoring the actual numbers, and the numbers are not hard to find. So where does the honest position land between the engineered apocalypse crowd and the nothing to see here crowd? It lands exactly in the middle, and the middle is not a boring compromise, it is the truth. This is an extreme but physically explainable event. It is not a secret weapon, and it is not a hoax. It is a strong, stuck ridge of high pressure, doing exactly what the physics says a strong, stuck ridge should do, on a baseline that has been warmed enough to make the extreme end of the range more reachable than it used to be. No conspiracy required to explain it, no denial capable of waving it away, just a dome and the loaded dice underneath it, producing a genuinely dangerous weekend that we can understand completely without inventing a villain or burying our heads in the sand. I want to spend one more moment on why the engineered dome idea is so persistently appealing, because understanding the appeal is more useful than just swatting the claim away. When something bad and dramatic happens, the human mind reaches instinctively for agency, for a who rather than a what. A deliberate act, even a malicious one, feels more comprehensible than a vast impersonal system doing what physics dictates, because agency is something we can imagine confronting. A dome that someone built could, in principle, be exposed and stopped. A dome that forms because a warmed atmosphere and a buckled jet stream conspired to stall a ridge over dry land is far harder to sit with, because there is no one to confront, only a system to understand. So the engineered explanation is not really about the evidence, which does not support it. It is about the discomfort of the true explanation, which asks us to accept that no one is steering this, that it is emerging from the ordinary workings of a changed atmosphere. I understand the pull, but the physics does not bend to make us more comfortable, and the honest path is to sit with the harder truth. There is also a version of the skeptical claim that deserves a fair hearing, the one that says forecasters and media hype these events for attention, that every summer now comes with breathless warnings that make the ordinary sound apocalyptic. And I will grant that weather coverage can lean toward the dramatic, and that a steady diet of red alert graphics can numb people until they tune it all out, which is its own kind of danger. But the corrective for hype is not denial, it is specificity, and the specifics this weekend are not hype. An extreme heat warning is a defined product with defined criteria, not a marketing term. An all-time record is an objective threshold, not an opinion. 29.99% of the country in severe drought is a measured figure. 10 large fires is a count, not a vibe. When you strip away the tone of the coverage and look only at the measured quantities, the event is exactly as serious as the careful language says it is. The antidote to hype is to look at the numbers, and the numbers hold up. So hold both of these things at once, because that is what intellectual honesty on this topic actually requires. Reject the conspiracy because the physics rules it out. Reject the dismissal because the numbers rule it out. And land in the middle, where the truth actually lives, which is that a natural but extreme event is being amplified by a warmed baseline into something genuinely dangerous. Something we can understand completely and should take completely seriously. Without a villain and without a shrug. That middle ground is not a failure to take a side. It is the side. It is the one the evidence actually supports. And I think that honest middle is actually the most unsettling place to stand, because a secret weapon could in theory be switched off, and a hoax could be dismissed. But a dome that forms naturally on a tilted table cannot be switched off or dismissed. It can only be understood and prepared for and watched. Which brings us to the question that this entire weekend has been building toward. The question that turns this from a story about right now into a story about what comes next. Because as bad as this weekend is, as many records as fall and as many fires as burn, the forecast is telling us something that I have been holding back until now, and it is the most important thing in this entire video. This is not the end of the pattern. It might not even be the worst of it. Let me show you what the models see coming, and why the phrase far from over is not a tease, it is a warning. Part 10, Far from Over. Everything I have shown you so far, The all-time records, the deadly warm nights, the drought, the 10 fires, the drowning east, the loaded dice, all of it describes this weekend, and if this weekend were the whole story, it would be enough. But it is not the whole story, and the part I have been holding back is the part that turns a dangerous weekend into a genuine warning. Because when the forecasters look past Sunday, past the peak, into the following week and beyond, they do not see relief. They see the pattern digging in deeper. The long-range guidance shows a large, amplified dome of high-pressure forecast to lock in across the western and central United States through at least the 22nd of July. Read that again, not through Monday, not through the middle of next week, through at least the 22nd, and possibly beyond, because that is simply where the reliable forecast horizon ends, not where the pattern does. And this is not a weaker echo of the current dome. In some respects it is a larger one. It points to a high risk of extreme heat parked over the plains and the Mississippi Valley, with temperatures running 15 to 30 degrees above normal, heat index values between 100 and 110, and most ominously of all, given everything we now understand about why the nights matter, overnight lows once again barely dropping below the 70s. I want you to feel the weight of that last detail, because we spent real time earlier in this video on why warm nights are the killer, on Chicago in 1995 and the Pacific Northwest in 2021, on the way heat stress compounds night over night when the body never gets its reset. And now the extended forecast is telling us that the same no-recovery nights are set to continue, not for a weekend, but for the better part of 2 weeks, over a huge population across the plains and the Mississippi Valley. That is the combination that strains the power grid, as millions of air conditioners run around the clock with no overnight break. That is the combination that puts vulnerable people in real danger, not for one night, but for many nights in a row. There is no sign of a real cool down anywhere in the near future. The lid is not lifting. The dome is settling in. So let me bring the central thread all the way home, because we have arrived at the place it was always leading. One stuck dome, 3 faces, is what this weekend is. But the phrase far from over means that the dome, or its successor, is not moving on. It is going to keep pushing cities toward records. It is going to keep deepening a drought that already covers nearly a third of the country. It is going to keep curing the fuels under fires that are already burning and priming the ground for new ones. The spiral we talked about, heat feeding drought feeding fire, does not get to unwind if the dome does not leave. And the forecast says the dome does not leave. That is why this is a warning, and not just a weekend. The machine is not switching off. It is resetting for another run. Let me make the grid danger concrete, because it is one of the most underappreciated consequences of a prolonged no-recovery heat event, and it connects the abstract forecast to something everyone depends on. Electricity demand does not just rise on a hot afternoon and fall at night. During a stuck heat dome with warm nights, demand stays elevated around the clock because the air conditioners never get to shut off. Normally the overnight hours are when the grid catches its breath, when demand falls and the system has slack to recover and to perform maintenance. Strip that overnight relief away for days on end, and you are running the grid near its limits continuously, with no rest, in the exact conditions, extreme heat, that also make the equipment itself more likely to fail. That is how heat waves cause blackouts, and a blackout during a heat wave is not an inconvenience. It is a lethal event, because it takes away the air conditioning that vulnerable people are depending on to survive the very heat that caused the outage. The extended forecast of warm nights across the plains and Mississippi Valley is, among other things, a multi-day stress test of the power grid, and the stakes of that test are measured in lives. I keep using the word pattern rather than storm or event, and I want to be deliberate about that, because it is the heart of what makes this forecast different. A storm is a thing that happens and ends. A pattern is a configuration that persists and keeps producing things. What the extended models are describing is not a second storm. It is the same pattern, the same amplified, buckled, stalled state of the atmosphere, continuing to hold, continuing to build ridges over the western centre, continuing to bake and dry and burn. The all-time records this weekend are one product of the pattern. The heat next week is another product of the same pattern. The fires that grow and the new ones that start are more products of the same pattern. When you understand it as a pattern rather than a sequence of separate events, the phrase far from over stops being ominous filler and becomes a precise description. The thing generating all of this has not left, and the forecast says it is not going to relieve for a while, and that reframes what we should even be paying attention to. It is natural to focus on the peak, on Sunday, on whether Salt Lake City or Billings actually tips over its all-time record. Those are real and worth watching. But the deeper story is not any single day's high. It is the persistence, the refusal of the pattern to break, the way it threatens to hold heat and drought and fire in place over the same regions for the better part of 2 weeks, and possibly beyond. A record is a moment, a stuck pattern is a siege, and it is the siege, not the moment, that determines how much damage this ultimately does, how many fires grow, how much the drought deepens, how many nights the vulnerable have to endure without recovery. The record is the headline, the persistence is the story. And this is where I want to return to the honest question we raised earlier, the one about luck versus loaded dice, because now it has teeth. If this were a single freak dome, a one-off roll that came up ugly, then we could wait it out and file it away. But that is not what we are looking at. We are looking at a dome that formed on a warmed, tilted table, that stalled the way stuck patterns increasingly seem to stall, that is threatening records set during the worst heat and drought decade in the country's history, and that the models say will be followed immediately by another one just like it, or bigger. The pattern is not passing through. It is taking up residence. And that raises the deepest question of all, the one I cannot answer for you and neither can anyone else, because we are living inside the experiment that will answer it. Is this weekend's assault on the all-time record books a fluke of July 2026, an extreme but essentially random pattern that will eventually pass and be forgotten? Or is it an early legible signature of something larger, a warmed, wavier, stickier atmosphere in which domes like this one become more frequent, more intense, and more prone to getting stuck, stacking heat and drought and fire on top of one another, until one of them parks over exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time and simply refuses to move? Because that is the real fear underneath all the numbers. Not this dome, the next one, and the one after that. The question is not whether this weekend is dangerous. We know it is. The question is whether this weekend is the exception or the rehearsal. Before I leave you with the final thought, I want to translate all of this into something you can actually use. Because unlike a distant asteroid or a dying star, this is a threat you can prepare for, and preparation genuinely matters. If you are anywhere in the affected regions, treat the coming days as the extended, serious event the forecast says it is, not as a normal hot stretch. Plan for the nights as much as the days, because the nights are where the danger concentrates, and find a way to keep at least one space cool enough to sleep in and recover. Check on the vulnerable people in your life repeatedly, not just once, because a multi-day event wears people down progressively, and someone who was fine on day 1 may be in trouble by day 4. If you are in fire country, take the red flag conditions seriously and avoid anything that could throw a spark, because under 5 to 15% humidity and wind, the fire you start is not one you can take back. And if you are on the wet side of this pattern, in the flood zones, respect the water, because more people die driving into flooded roads than almost any other way in these events. None of this is dramatic. All of it is the ordinary, unglamorous work of getting through a stuck pattern, and it is the work that actually saves lives. I also want to gently place this weekend in the context of what we have been tracking on this channel, because it does not stand alone. We talked a few days ago about the drought spreading across the country, and this weekend that drought is the fuel bed under the fire. We talked a few days ago about the wildfires tearing through the interior west, and this weekend those fires are the third face of this very dome. We talked yesterday about a locked, stubborn pattern setting up for the middle of July, and this weekend is that locked pattern arriving. And we talked about a week ago about the ceiling of human heat tolerance and why the warm nights are the thing that kills. Every one of those threads runs straight into this weekend. This is not a new and separate story. It is the convergence of the ones we've been following, all arriving at once under one dome. That continuity is itself part of the warning, because it shows you that these are not random unrelated events, but the recurring output of an atmosphere that keeps assembling the same dangerous configuration. Here is what I keep coming back to, and I will leave you with it. For most of human history, we built our cities and our farms and our whole civilization on an unspoken assumption that the weather, however harsh it got, would eventually move on, The storm would pass, the heat would break, the dome would slide east and let something else come in behind it. That assumption is written into everything we are, into where we chose to live and how we chose to build. But a dome that will not move, followed by another dome that will not move, is a quiet challenge to that oldest assumption. It is the atmosphere asking a question we never thought we would have to answer. What happens to a civilization built on the promise that the weather always changes, when the weather more and more often decides to stay? This weekend, in the cities on the edge of their all-time records, under the same sky that is burning the west and drowning the east, we are watching the first draft of that answer being written, and it is far from over.